Are we ready for a world where cybersecurity is not just reactive, but proactive? Well, in today's episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast, I'm going to delve into the dynamic field of cybersecurity with Nick and Giles from NetSPI. And recently rebranded, NetSPI has launched a unified proactive security platform and are aiming to reshape how businesses approach their digital defences. So I want to find out more and discuss the latest trends, the evolving role of CISOs, not to mention the upcoming EU regulations that could change the game for financial institutions. Reaching listeners in 165 countries every day is testament to the unwavering support of you, my listeners, and our sponsors, without whom this podcast just simply wouldn't be possible. And it also gives me a chance to talk about the fact that legacy DRM failed to securely enable external collaboration, especially on sensitive files, and how every organisation faces this risk-trust contradiction where they can share content with untrusted third parties, yet expected to protect that data. So it's time for something more modern, a DRM solution that solves that dilemma without compromising security or productivity. And you can do all that with a company called Kiteworks that will enable you to say goodbye to deployment headaches, file transfer risk, collaboration barriers, and productivity constraints, so you can experience a more modern way to collaborate on sensitive content without sacrificing control or security. Please visit kiteworks.com to get started today. That's kiteworks.com to get started today. Now is the moment you've really been waiting for. It's time to get today's guest on. Well, buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the UK, where you can join myself, Nick and Giles from NetSPI as we take a deep dive into this. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Nick. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
I'm Nick Walker, the Regional Director for NetSPI in EMEA. Bit of background on NetSPI. NetSPI is the proactive security solution with 20 years of experience in all things pen testing. They originated in the US, and my role here is to expand that business into the EMEA region, adapting our approach to meet customers' needs on this side of the pond, and building strategic pen test programs with some of the biggest firms in the world. So my career in this space started out very technical. I studied the world's first ethical hacking degree in Dundee in Scotland, a place called Abertay University. And thankfully, as part of that course every year, you got a chance to kind of stretch your legs with a research project of your choosing, which was kind of my place to go and enjoy my freedom outside of the course material. So I chose to specialize in memory corruption vulnerabilities, so typically the stuff that's in C, C++ type programs, and mobile security, which was a bit of a weird combination, but it was when I was at university, it was when the first Android phone came out. So I was pretty interested there. So I was the weird guy that actually really enjoyed code review. For some reason in the pen testing world, that's a bit of a hot take. And my research there led me to speaking at a number of conferences over the years, taking part in things like Pwn to Own 2013 with some of my colleagues at MW1 for security, which now no longer exists. I guess throughout my consultancy years, I've worked as a tech lead for some huge clients, some big ones in the fintech industry in particular, managing large pen testing programs for them. And of course, that results in interacting with executives, senior leadership on a regular basis, and kind of being exposed to that bigger picture outside of your one project, right? That a lot of the pen testers are kind of honed in on. And through that, getting a kind of understanding of the more nuanced parts of their problems and how they manage their risk, coupled with that, with my technical background, has accidentally set me up quite well to run consultancy firms within EMEA. Younger me was convinced I would always stay down in the weeds and be boots on the ground with the tools, sitting in my basement with a debugger, wearing a hoodie. But grown-up me kind of saw the impact that I could have when I started looking at the problem from broader angles. So here I'm sitting here wearing a suit, kind of meeting with execs and applying that technical knowledge I learned over the years to support those businesses that I worked with in consultancy before to now, on a broader scale, manage their risk.
You tell me you're sat there in a suit, but I suspect underneath the desk there's shorts and Converse or something going on, right? Because
very much jeans and comfy trainers, but I'm not a shorts guy. That's for sure.
Love it. Well, welcome to the show, Nick. And of course, we've got Giles joining you today on the podcast as well. So, Giles, can you just tell everyone listening a little about you too?
Hi, Neil. Yeah, absolutely. So I have a bit of a different sort of more vocational background in the way that I kind of came into things. I was originally a forestry labourer, so chopping down trees and digging ditches many years ago. And then used that, the money I saved up to get my first qualifications in IT, and then done all sorts of kind of infrastructure and project-based stuff over the last, I don't know how long it is now. It's probably about 15 to 18 years somewhere. I've stopped counting them, much like where my hairline starts and ends. It's something that I try and glaze over a little bit. But I kind of, these days, I'm a bit of a dual class paladin and rogue, as I would say. So I do a bit of the red team side of things, and kind of at NetSPI, I look after a number of our infrastructure services, including red team. But my passion is really sort of helping organizations understand all of their controls together, all of the kind of the people, process and technology side of things, and how that all weaves together, and then kind of testing that holistically. So red teaming, to those that don't know the term, is that really, for want of a better way of putting it, and it feeds into a lot of kind of the regulated frameworks that are coming out at the moment. But generally speaking, aside from that, I am a sysadmin, a recovering sysadmin, I think is probably the way that I would refer to it. So I've spent time on the kind of the defensive side of things. So I use that to kind of drive my advisory capability to understand the challenges that the people that I work with, our clients. It's important from my perspective to have that understanding, to sort of not sat on the hedge, but had a foot in both fields to really sort of understand what and why we're advising what we're advising, and not just purely come at it from one particular discipline or another. And that's not to say it's right or wrong. I like that kind of that sort of moderated view, if you will.
Well, a big thank you to both of you for sitting down with me today. And when I was doing a little research before you came on the podcast, one of the things I quickly was reading up on is how your business has rebranded. So I think we should start there, really. Can you tell me a little bit more about NetSPI and its current mission, and maybe a little bit more about the rebrand, and ultimately, what does it mean for your business ambitions?
Yeah, so it's been an exciting year for NetSPI, not only because I've been here a year now, but we've made 3 big announcements for the business this year. Obviously, the rebrand is kind of the big component of that. So we've updated our positioning, our visual branding, and the website experience, which I think now more accurately reflects our kind of evolving role in this space and in the cybersecurity industry as a whole. Every part of that brand element brings, I think, NetSPI, like a vision of NetSPI's dedication to its customers, kind of alignment with the proactive security category. It shows the innovation. I think it's quite a modern branding and the innovation that we have across our solution. So we've got kind of 3 main sections to our business. So we've got PTaaS, which is an acronym I'll explain because I'm sure a lot of your listeners might not have heard some of these before. So PTaaS is quite a common one. So that's pen testing as a service. We've got ASM, which is attack surface management, and breach and attack simulation, BAS, right? So I might mention those acronyms later in the conversation, so just so we don't have to go through the detail of that again. So alongside that, we've also launched a new platform, and that's in tandem with the rebrand. We've unveiled a unified proactive security platform, which we hope will enable our customers to take a more proactive approach to cybersecurity with more clarity, more speed and scale, right? The difficulty we've got these days is information overload, and we're trying to bring clarity to that process and help CISOs make really good decisions about what they have, where they have it, and how they might manage that risk. So yeah, this kind of means we can help customers build a more complete picture of what they've got, where they have the risk, and what the joined up dots of all of that mean. Particularly in terms of the impact of the business and the risk that they've got in those places. Implied in that, obviously, is you'll be able to infer the guidance about the best places to spend the effort and improve their security posture overall. So at NetSPI, we've got a really clear vision. Later this year, customers can expect to see the ASM, the BAS products, and PTaaS all joined together alongside new risk prioritization and some exposure management capabilities. So consolidation of all those into that single platform will significantly improve the company's abilities to deliver more, I guess, timely and impactful outcomes, build your products faster, and just operate as a business in a more robust and effective way. Also, with PTaaS, ASM, and BAS all tied together, we'll be able to draw insights from those. So from PTaaS and ASM, you see all of your assets and your vulnerabilities, and we can tie those risks to gaps that we can identify in your vision of what's going on in your network through the breach and attack simulation component of the platform, right? And so we can make inferences between what you've got, where it lives, how you see it, what individual risks each of those components have, and kind of build a view of where that risk sits and where is the best place to fix it. So it kind of highlights exactly how an attacker might move through your network from points of origin to points of failure.
And I love how you mentioned there the proactive approach and the need for that, because we've all seen what happens with the reactive side of things to cybersecurity. We've seen the dangers of alert fatigue, and there's so many different attacks. Just this week, there was the 10 billion passwords that were breached, there's ransomware, and of course, AI being used for both attack and defense purposes. But I've got to ask, what trends are you seeing in cybersecurity right now? Because there's so much going on. It seems to be bombarding our news feeds every day, but what are you seeing?
Yeah, there's a lot, and we could probably speak for a week just on that topic. But I would say there's kind of a few areas that are at the forefront of the, let's call it the industry's collective mind at the moment. You've got, of course, the elephant in the room, which is generative AI, right? You can't have a security podcast without talking about generative AI. Kind of hot topic there is the rate of adoption versus the depth of understanding that the businesses that are adopting these technologies have, and about how to manage those risks. It's a super strong technology, right? There's value to be had out of it, but that's got to be balanced with a deep understanding of what risks that can bring. And I would say not many organizations at the moment have the skills, at least in-house, needed to get out and in front of this problem and adequately test them. I think in a lot of ways, some of these Gen AI platforms are being embedded into web applications, and having those web application tested is great, but the methodology that's being applied across the board generally is not accounting for the mathematical approach needed to test those models accurately. Topic that I would say is it's a trend at the moment is, as it always has been, attacks are definitely getting a lot more complex, and keeping everything locked down and reacting to that in a reactive manner is pretty much impossible these days, as you said. Mm-hmm. And I would say that broadly, businesses are moving away from trying to manage that risk through point-in-time testing and resolving vulnerabilities in that way. Though that's still very important, as it's good to know where you sit with a particular application at a particular point in time and get vision of those vulnerabilities. We need to move to a model where businesses are thinking more about their understanding at a higher level about what assets they have as part of the holistic view, how they're joined together, what their critical points of failure are, and common pathways and managing the risk through the monitoring of those points. There's an understanding developing whereby it's less about identifying and understanding every vulnerability and every point of failure, and more about how do we understand what assets we have, what they mean to the bigger business, and how do we react when something goes wrong. This is where kind of Giles' side of the service delivery comes in. What do we do when something goes really bad, and what do we see? How do we notice it, and how do we react? And we're just changing the way that we think about the problem. So it's less about technical controls, because they're fairly reasonably easy to set up out the box these days. The default configurations in a lot of ways have come a long way away from where they were 10 years ago. They're still a key tool in our belts, but now it's more about that holistic view, seeing the whole picture, making conscious decisions about how you manage that information.
And of course, it feels sometimes that we've been talking about things like password breaches, phishing attempts, data hacks, ransomware, humans being the weakest link in cybersecurity, and the boardroom not understanding or appreciating the value of cybersecurity. We've been talking about this stuff for the last 10 years or more. So I'm curious, what has drastically changed about cybersecurity since you both started in the field? Anything you can share around that on what you're seeing changing? So
I guess there's quite a bit that's, I think, has changed in terms of the cybersecurity landscape. I think, Nick, you touched on some of the Gen AI and that type of things, but I think there's a great drive towards kind of single pane of glass visibility of all of the things when you're working in a security capacity. And that kind of platform unification and sort of centralization of information makes the life of a security professional easier, but also it provides a centralized target for an attacker, something to go after, something to wreck or ruin, if you will. I think the other things as well is the kind of the trend towards kind of through mergers and acquisitions of a lot of the kind of the security companies. We're seeing very kind of high reliance on single vendors to offer all of the solutions to all of the problems of the world, if you will. And that provides an interesting conundrum, because if you go to a vendor that can supply your compute power, your kind of your databases, your storage, your whatever you might choose, and also your security, they're not as focused. So that perhaps the level of security that comes from that is not as easy to kind of judge the quality of it. And then comes along a contender in the security space and sort of has a very focused security product. I think it's tricky. Yeah. I think if we rely on businesses that offer all of the services and all of that becomes centralized, we end up with a number of very small monopolies in that space. And I think that's a tricky question to answer, because we want these businesses to grow to be able to fund getting ahead of kind of threats and attackers, if you will. But equally, I think we probably kind of don't want to have to buy everything from one place and one place only. Kind of the Acme Corp sort of analogy, I think is where I would put that. Otherwise, trends, I think, aside from Gen AI, I think there's a trend towards the kind of ransomware as a perennial thing. I think it's becoming more and more a thing that's tied not just to sort of those who are criminally oriented, if you will. I think it's becoming much more of a kind of a wider sort of orchestra of hybrid warfare across the world. And there's lots of different regional things that go on. But I think we're seeing more and more of those two being very closely linked in the last sort of 10 years or so in terms of trends. And I guess that's pretty much it. Gen AI has probably drowned a number of the other things out in terms of what people are talking about. There are plenty of smaller things, but yeah, those are the biggies.
And Nick, obviously you've been on both sides of the fence here, from starting out in the hardcore techie space to being in a suit talking to me today. Yeah. As someone that's been on both sides of that fence, what are you seeing changing?
I guess the kind of the place I would see it is the barrier to entry has been substantially reduced, right?
Yeah.
When I was young, with less grey hair, looking a lot more attractive than I do today, there weren't really any resources to learn how to misuse these systems, abuse the systems, make them do things they weren't intended to do. These days, there are really good learning resources out there. Things like pre-built labs, playgrounds, intentionally vulnerable challenges that you can work your way through to get your hands dirty in practical terms and really learn on the job without actually messing with anybody's systems. And being able to do that really accelerates your understanding in these realistic scenarios, and it's quite easy to get off the ground. So there's a flip side to that coin, and it's that, of course, with that understanding of how these things work, being so easy to get to, at least in the lower end, the collective knowledge of the industry has grown substantially, right? And so there are less and less low-hanging fruits these days. Our job gets harder. So does the dark side of the coin, the attackers. It gets harder for them. But they learn just as well as you and me do. And that's meant, because that low-hanging fruit's gone, there's more and more complex detections and more robust technical defenses. The problem's obviously not gone away, because we're still sat here having this conversation. So clearly the top end of the problem, the extremely complex and more technical attacks, are growing. Our job in there is shifting towards that, and it's getting more and more difficult to defend, which is why I think there's this shift in approach to looking at it more holistically, right? And so it's easier to get into as an industry overall, but that gap between being good and great these days on both the red and the blue sides is bigger than it's ever been.
And we are seeing an increase in data breaches and cyber attacks, with stories hitting our headlines, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, almost on a daily basis. So I'm curious, do you think there's a need, or an increased need, should I say, for CISOs? And how are you seeing their roles evolving over time too? Is the boardroom waking up to the threats now and the value of the CISO brings?
Yeah, I think so. On the visibility of the breaches side, I do think there are more breaches generally, but I think the headlines are more prevalent because businesses are getting better at noticing quickly when something's gone wrong, and they have an obligation to be open and upfront about that morally. And a basic understanding of cybersecurity as a concept for Joe Blogg, member of the public, is now really common. So we see and share more of it. So I just think there's more noise and kerfuffle around about what's going on, and people are just seeing a lot more of it. There is definitely an increase on that side of the fence in terms of breaches, but part of that is the fact that people are just more knowledge about it, and it's more in front of people these days. And that could only be a good thing, right?
Yeah.
There's always been a need for someone to hold and manage responsibility for the cyber risk of all businesses, big through small. And whether you call them a CISO or not, I don't think that's changed very much. I think the CISO role itself has become much more of a mature position than it was 10 years ago. Moving from that reactive place of making sure everything's had its annual pen test and we'll deal with an incident when it happens, to someone whose role is now to manage huge and detailed proactive programs of testing, and just as importantly, track the metrics that represent the success of those efforts. It's leading more towards getting an understanding of context and how your efforts in that cyber space are being effective or not. So they need to understand where they're spending their hard for cyber budget, right? The economy's tough right now. Budgets on the cyber side are increasing disproportionately to the margins of those companies. So it's clear that CISOs are having the impact they need, and that the businesses as a whole understand the need for important spend in this space. What they're doing is changing how they spend it. So with that comes things like threat intelligence and applying tactics, techniques, and procedures that specifically apply to your business to get more value out of that spend. So instead of running your generic red team, come in, see what you can hit, see how we respond to it, it's very much more guided spend now. So they can specifically address those threats that they're facing under the context of all the information they managed to gather about their efforts, right? So getting that deeper and more complete understanding of the assets they've got, building an asset register and the risks associated with those assets through something like attack surface management tools. That's a bit of a mouthful sometimes. Helps them build that kind of big picture they need to start applying those changes that are effective. The way that CISOs are resolving those issues has also changed, right? So critical vulnerabilities are not always the first things that get prioritized for fixing anymore. Gone are the days where a CVSS score of a 9 or whatever was panic stations, we've got to patch this today. And the lows are not always the lowest on the list. And so with that bigger picture approach that we spoke about earlier, it might mean that 2 medium risk issues, when applied to the context of your business in combination, pose much more of a substantial problem together, and they may get prioritized over a more critical on-paper vulnerability. Like, for example, the recent SSH regression vulnerability that you may have seen in the news, right? That vulnerability gives root access to systems. And from a technical perspective, that's really bad and critical for business, but it's also a really complex race condition memory corruption vulnerability. And currently there's no exploit code for 64-bit systems, which is what everybody's running on. So that may not be prioritized for your business over those 2 medium vulnerabilities when applied to that bigger picture that the CISOs have got. I guess context is super important. And in summary, I would probably say that we're moving away from that single vulnerability CVSS score system to a model of kind of deeper understanding of what those risks mean in real impact and context, and adapting the approaches that we're taking to reduce the risks using our model.
And Giles, is there anything that you're seeing in how the roles of CISOs are evolving? Any observations from you on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably quite a few from my side of things. I think to sort of in general terms, I think often sort of the early CISOs of the world were techies in a suit who were thrown to the board because they kind of understood their science, if you will, more often than not. And that was quite the kind of the traditional pathway. And as there's been more frameworks and sort of learning pathways and kind of adoption of the kind of and more of a kind of a definition of what that role looks like, they are now fully much more members of the board, if you will. They act as a translation layer much more, and sort of being able to talk about the wider business and enterprise risk to the rest of the board, rather than just being the sort of that person who converted from one trade to another. They're now very much in that house. That means that they've got a lot of responsibilities around sort of cost rationalization and sort of looking at how to spend budget effectively and make the right decisions about where to invest the budget that they've got and the kind of how much security realistically that actually brings to them as an organization in general terms. And I think that's quite a change in the approach and the level of maturity the individual needs to have in the way the soft skills of a CISO have to be probably much more refined now than in the early days of the role itself, where you could be a very technical, slightly acidic human being and know what you very well and be very successful in that role. Now you have to apply significant soft skills to kind of talk to the other C-suite members or to the security team to kind of act on behalf of both and to make sure that you get the best results for the business. And it's quite a perilous job. There's probably not the right way to think about this, but often many a CISO will think themselves kind of on the chopping block every single day. So they've got to be a very resilient human being to be able to fulfill that role. And I think that's probably something with the rise in kind of publicization of breaches. Some lean into the kind of the angle of wanting to be as strong and resilient as possible. Some and sort of the deniers, if for want of a better way of putting it, in the world. And some now, through regulation and enforcement, are actually sort of being encouraged. And we're seeing a great uptick in this, in being communicative, open, talking about the challenges, talking about the failures as well as the successes of their roles. And in things like post-breach activities, talking about the lessons learned, and after red team type activities and those types of scenario-based tests, that now they're becoming much more humble in the way that they express themselves. It's a really positive change because now we get to hear about the things that occur and that we all get to learn and share intelligence and mature the market more widely, both from a kind of a proactive security testing point of view, but also from the kind of proactive defensive view as well. We all get to learn from each other better. As a red teamer, I've been thrown into many pits of fire, many meetings to adversarial thinking. Often people in the defensive role treat my role in that situation as someone that's come to sort of mark their homework, if you will. And that's not necessarily, it's not a bad thing. I might be giving them an A and telling them that they're doing really well, for want of a better way of putting it. But actually it's to talk pragmatically about what can be done, what challenges do their configuration choices, budget choices make, and bring them and to their controls, help consolidate that. And then rather than riding off into the sunset, actually sort of help them through that process of transition to a more secure organization. So I think the CISO has to be much more mature, much more adult these days, much more soft skills oriented, as well as having technical skills too. And they have to be that hybrid, all things to all men, as they say, or indeed all things to all people, really, in real terms. And I think that's what we see now. Whereas before it was okay to be very singular. Now you have to be much more broad in your role.
And you mentioned the word resilience there a few times, and it brings me back to something that I always have on this podcast every day. I try and take a topic that people maybe heard things about, but a little unsure on what it means to them and their business. And one of the things that I'm reading more and more about lately is the European Union's Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA, which is much more catchy. So my question to both of you, if we can try and demystify this today, what exactly is DORA and why do we need it, just for any business leaders listening?
I'll jump in there because it is in fact why my hairline is now currently a few inches behind where it was. So it's a big thing, but it's also a thing that's existed for a little while in some of what it asks organizations to do. So it's a law and a framework that will bring together some of the things that some of the kind of the UCB and the European Union have been doing for a little while now, things like TIBA testing, for instance, or threat-led pen. They refer to generally as threat-led pen testing, what others might refer to as red teaming. But what that does is enshrines in law a number of things that were frameworks or guidance practices that organizations and regulators were encouraging financial institutions to do. What it tries to do is, for want of a better way of putting this, enforce good behavior. So that's things like intelligence sharing that I mentioned before, but also how do you sort of testing and planning for how you react to a breach, testing your people, process and technology across an enterprise with scenario-based testing, red teaming, to really stress test, for want of a better way of putting it, the organization as a whole, as a holistic entity, and all of the things that you've done together. And it's particularly pertinent because what it does is it puts that to organizations that will have done that before, the kind of the big banks, the financial sort of organizations across Europe, or those that kind of have significant presence in Europe, if you will, in different jurisdictional areas. So large financial institutions such as banks will have to do those tests that are the same, very similar to Tiber tests. They're a mature market, but also a very immature market will be asked to do this. So organizations like cryptocurrency exchanges, or kind of other smaller wealth management organizations, or organizations that haven't had to do this before. So there's going to be a mixture of very mature organizations doing what they've always done and helping sort of steer that market. And a lot of those are getting ahead of that and sort of doing proactive sort of red teaming assessments before the deadline to make sure that they've got everything in place, but also to buy a little bit of time before when they need to next do those. A number of the regulators, or TCTs, are encouraging organizations to do that, to kind of buy them some time before they next have to do those tests. And then the kind of on the less mature side of things, there's going to be a glut of organizations that have never had to do this before. Perhaps they've got a pen test program. Perhaps they've got some vulnerability management sort of capability within their organization. Now they're being thrown right into the kind of the perceived apex or top end of testing. The interesting thing is the frameworks and the kind of the law behind it that drives the Tiber framework especially is actually quite a pragmatic one. And it's quite a sort of handhold through the process way of approaching things. And it's much more around learning objectives and making sure that those organizations are able to get every single drop of learning and knowledge sharing and capability increase, if you will, that they can from those exercises. So there's all sorts of workshops and exercises that come out at the back end of it, 360 workshops, purple teaming, various other things where we work in as a sort of security testing or pen test company as part of our capacity. We work together really closely and go through every single play of what we do. As far as testing components go, it's a very rigorous and very serious framework, but it's not unapproachable because it's being built to be up to the point where everybody can go into it and get walked through it every single time, whether or not they're mature. It's a very solid way of kind of maturing businesses at scale in the finance markets. For instance, in the UK, standards like CBEST have been around a little longer, and you just have to look around in terms of the kind of the banking sector, the finance sector, and how that's really sort of matured that market over the last 10 years or so, which is a very positive sign indeed. Tiber has also been around for a while. It will be updated and sort of brought into the DORA legislation as part of that. There's also, I'm very passionate about the testing side of things, but there's also other things around the kind of the intelligence sharing. How do you communicate with your peers? How do you enable them to be able to see breach information, or where you're seeing active threats trying to exploit your environment? How do you share that to your peers to enable them to defend themselves better in advance? What it's trying to do is make that ecosystem and sort of build it across Europe. And Europe is a really big target for a lot of this for various reasons, diplomatic, economic, and various other drivers. Europe as an entity, and every major financial institution in there has been encouraged to do this just to make sure that the things that literally keep the light on, people going to work, or lights on, and people going to work are maintained. I don't need to talk about kind of how important it is to be able to pay your mortgage. I'm sure we've all experienced or indeed your rent, or anything of that nature. We want to make sure that continues to happen. So we at NetSPI test that to help those organizations really validate it. So yeah, a bit of a long answer, but it can be complex, the complex framework.
And as you said there, it enshrines it in law. But the scary thing for a lot of people listening is that I think the cutoff date is the 17th of January next year, which is just 6 months away. So I've got to ask, I don't want to scare anyone here, but what are the consequences if a business doesn't comply with DORA in Europe by 17th of January next year? Anything you can share on that?
Yeah, so I'll jump back in there. I don't mind Nick, me sort of taking the reins there. I've got to ask my boss. Yeah. But I think in terms of the kind of the compliance, I think it's not necessarily absolutely everything in place, and you've got everything sort of in hand to kind of produce as like your papers the moment that January 17th kicks in. So this allows for a testing cycle, for instance, as part of that testing process, and not every part of that has to be yearly. So where you've got the Tiber tests that I've spoken to before, actually you're probably most likely only needing to do one of those every 3 years, and you'll be notified in advance, generally speaking, that this will be your turn, your year when that occurs. But you are encouraged to do testing at a similar standard or the same standard, which you can drive internally on the other 2 of the 3. So that you get to keep that tempo and that pace, but it's not got the same level of oversight, the same level of kind of everybody being part of a group. So the regulator, the institution, threat intelligence provider, and the pen test provider all coming together to make sure that it's the best level of successful it can be. In short terms, kind of the short answer is, if you think about the level of financial impact to organizations that GDPR had and GDPR fines had, broadly speaking, cut that in half, and that's what DORA can represent to an organization. So whereas GDPR was, I believe, broadly 4% of kind of global revenue annually, DORA is actually closer to 2% in terms of the revenue side of things. But then there's also the kind of the 1% monthly as well, which can occur. So the guidance on DORA is some of it still being formed, some of it relatively limited, and some of it being implemented. But the perception at the moment is that those are 2 separate things. So you can have the 2% of annual turnover and the 1% monthly as a rolling fine, if you will, for continued non-compliance. And that could be policies and processes and documentation to support the fact that you've got a good business resiliency framework, ISO 27001 and ISMS and all of the stuff that comes with that. It's about all of those things in unison together. So you need to make sure that each of those different disciplines that DORA mandates, you can evidence on a continuing basis, and then you can do on the rolling basis the different types of testing that you need to do as well. One thing that I haven't mentioned is actually these tests are able to start from a supply chain side of things, and it tests the entire organization. So it could be the things that are most important, like mainframe that have never been touched before, or your crypto exchange, or these types of things. So it is truly the whole organization that it focuses on, and the kind of the implementation of ICT as part of that organization, but the people behind it, the dependent systems, the critical functions. It is as comprehensive as any testing framework has ever aimed to be.
And Nick, just to bring you into this here, DORA is just one example. There appears to be so many different number of regulations and frameworks businesses need to follow in the coming years. Any advice you can offer for CISOs dealing with this increased cyber attack surface, but also trying to remain compliant with these increasing frameworks at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, as Giles said, it's fairly well structured and less complex than some of the previous compliance frameworks that we've seen before. But obviously, you can't get any better support than reaching out to the people that are going to be doing the testing for these kind of engagements in understanding exactly what it is you need to do. So reach out to your suppliers if they've already got DORA compliant testing schemes. They're fairly similar to Cyber EU, CBEST, those styles of engagements. A lot of organizations we've seen over the last year are doing, I guess, what we'd call dry runs of these styles of engagements to get a flavor and prep themselves for being prepared for this when it comes in. And so the clock is ticking, but a lot of people have already started. If you haven't already started, it's about time to.
I think that's a beautiful moment to end on. But before I do let you go, I think the one thing that we all have in common at the moment is struggling to keep up with the speed and the pace of technological change. And we're all in this state of continuous learning. So I'd love to get a few tips off both of you here. Giles, I'll come to you first. Where or how do you self-educate out there and keep on top of these trends?
That's an interesting one. As a badge-holding imposter syndrome suffering individual, I don't think I necessarily am. A lot of people look to security testers or hackers, ethical hackers, whatever you may wish to term us, as kind of people who know everything, or we're often encouraged to know everything at all times. Not the case, I dare say, and also my wife would tell me. And I think from my perspective, I learn a lot on the job. I have to learn a lot on the job. So I will constantly encounter new implementations of technology that I've never seen before, and I have to go out, read the docs, read the manual, as they say, on a daily basis. But for me, about the wider learning, the kind of the talking to individuals, the kind of understanding the challenges, I'm quite lucky in what I do, that I get to talk to people who are in the kind of the top sides of businesses day to day and understand sort of how they approach things and kind of what their ethos is. And it's much more, as I said before, much more about soft skills and those types of things. Aside from that, I occasionally get time to read a book at the side of a pool maybe once a year if I'm lucky. But I think work is never far away in my field. So yeah, that's a rare chance for me to learn anything new. And my son's teaching me things all the time. So there we go.
Oh, beautiful. So how old's your son and what does he teach you? Because he's scary just how knowledgeable the kids are now, isn't it?
Yeah, he's just starting school very soon, and he teaches me all about, well, I guess about humility, and he learns new things all the time, and he's like a sponge. And I often wish that I was like that, especially in the kind of the industry, and it kind of encourages us to know all things at all times. So yeah, he teaches me that. So there are things in this world that can be learned much quicker than I have the capacity to do it, and he can enjoy doing it at the same time. So yeah.
Love it. And Nick, what about yourself there? How do you self-educate? How do you keep up to speed with things? Any tips?
Yeah, so I would say for me, it's definitely changed over the years as I've worn my two hats of being down in the weeds in the technical space and moving into this executive era. So yeah, back when I was actively pen testing, performing research, for me, learning was sitting down with the project, getting as far as I could, just following my nose until you hit a brick wall, hopefully not too painfully. At that point, you got a pretty clear indication of a gap in your knowledge and a gap in your understanding that you need to dig deeper into and address, right? So following your nose, working on things that interest you, pushing into these uncomfortable places where you're faced with the things that stop you progressing, and your learning's guided by those difficulties. These days, I would say I'm faced with helping other people resolve their problems, and that's a very different course of learning. So obviously I can draw on that previous experience and in the understanding of the tech, but there's a wealth of knowledge stored in the experience of other people in industry, the problems that those CISOs have gone through and how they resolved them and what worked and what didn't work. Broadening that knowledge through exposure and networking, and again, those people's successes and failures. And I can take that now and apply that to each new experience and new person that I meet and the problems that they've got, and kind of, I would say my personal growth is now driven by networking and other people and applying that experience to kind of refine what I do.
Well, we covered so much in a short amount of time today, but for anyone that would love to continue this conversation, maybe find out more information about NetSPI or even connect with you on a personal level, if you've got a website or LinkedIn, etc. But Nick, to begin with, where would you like to send everyone?
Yeah, so I would send everybody over to netspi.com, our main website. We've also got a LinkedIn channel where we post all of our news, customer stories, things like this podcast. And we also share what it's like to work for us. I'm also available on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me and have a conversation. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll get the links added to that. And Giles, anywhere additionally you'd like me to post links to, like your LinkedIn, etc.?
Yeah, LinkedIn's always a good one. Unfortunately, the bat signal is out of operation at the moment. I'm saving up for some repairs. But like Nick said, check us out on our website and reach out via LinkedIn. We're friendly faces and we're here to help.
Well, excellent. Well, I'll get all those links added to the show notes so people can find you nice and easy. Love learning more about NetSPI, your mission since the business rebrand, and also some of those key trends that you're both seeing in the cybersecurity industry and what has changed since you start, and also this growing number of regulations and frameworks and how to overcome them. And I do hope you get that bat signal fixed pretty soon because it is essential. And Nick, I hope you've got a big red phone in there somewhere as well. But more than anything, thank you for sharing your stories today.
It's on my Amazon wish list. I'll get one eventually.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate it.
Cheers, Neil. Thank you.
As we wrap up today's enlightening conversation with Nick and Giles from NetSPI, I think it's clear that the landscape of cybersecurity is undergoing a significant transformation. Whether it be the integration of generative AI or the strategic shifts in CISO roles, the challenges are complex as they are critical. But remember, you can continue this conversation online. You can visit NetSPI, you can chat to today's guest, you can chat to me. Email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilCHughes. Let me know your thoughts on adopting a proactive approach to cybersecurity, but how are you doing that? What challenges have you had to overcome? Have you encountered or implemented any innovative strategies that have reshaped your security posture that you would like to share with other business leaders? Please share your insights, join the discussion, let me know. Other than that, I will return again to your podcast feeds tomorrow morning with another guest and a different topic, but the message will be the same. How is technology transforming your life, your business, your world? Join me again for a discussion just like that. But thank you for listening today, and until next time, don't be a stranger.